Bronfman, Reifel, McGill. You know these names, carved into universities, museums, and city skylines. What you don't know is how they got rich. Not through innovation, not through hard work, but through the very things Canada now calls crimes. Smuggled whiskey, enslaved labor, narcotics by the ton. They built empires on vice, and then bought respectability with donations and endowments. The same money that built Canada's hospitals and universities must flowed from bootleg barrels, human bondage, and opium smoke. This is the story polite Canada never tells. Because when crime becomes wealth, and wealth becomes philanthropy, the truth becomes inconvenient. The Bronfmans, liquor kings of the lawless North. In the 1920s, America went dry. The 18th Amendment made it illegal to sell or produce alcohol. But thirst, as it turned out, does not obey the law. Just north of the border, in Saskatchewan, a family of Jewish immigrants saw an opportunity. They were the Bronfmans, a name that would soon become synonymous with both whiskey and respectability. Samuel Bronfman, the family patriarch, was a businessman with impeccable timing and a flexible sense of morality. When Prohibition swept through the United States, he transformed his small hotel liquor business into one of the most powerful bootlegging empires in North America. From the frozen rivers of Manitoba to the secret docks of Windsor, the Bronfman operation supplied illegal liquor to every major U.S. city starved of drink. Barrels labeled as medicinal spirits crossed the border by the hundreds. Customs officials were bribed. Shipping logs were forged. And in every direction, the Bronfman name grew richer, not in reputation, but in profit. By the mid-1920s, they were earning millions. And yet, by the time the U.S. repealed Prohibition in 1933, not a single Bronfman had spent a day in jail. They had done what few gangsters could, turned crime into corporate legitimacy. Their secret was transformation. When bootlegging ended, they took their profits and built Seagram, a legal liquor empire that would become one of the largest distillers in the world. And with that transformation came respectability. The same family that once trafficked contraband liquor was now hosting charity galas, funding museums, and advising prime ministers. Samuel's son, Edgar Bronfman Sr., would go on to lead the World Jewish Congress and become a key figure in international philanthropy. His grandson, Edgar Jr., became the CEO of Warner Music. The irony is almost poetic. A dynasty born from smuggling became a symbol of corporate Canada, a family whose donations built institutions that would later erase the memory of how their fortune began. Today, buildings bearing the Bronfman name stand at McGill, Concordia, and the Canadian Museum of Human Rights. Their story is told as one of entrepreneurial triumph, rarely as one of moral compromise. But the foundation remains the same: barrels on frozen rivers, secret shipments, and the quiet truth that Canada's most polished empire was built on the ruins of American Prohibition. The Reifels, Canada's opium barons. Long before fentanyl, long before the word epidemic filled headlines, Canada had another drug empire, and it was perfectly legal. At the dawn of the 20th century, while governments in Asia struggled to contain addiction, Canada's west coast was exporting narcotics by the ton. Behind it stood the Reifel family, wealthy, respected, and deeply connected to the corridors of power. Henry Reifel was not a street dealer. He was a businessman, owner of the British Columbia sugar refinery, brewer of beer, and licensed manufacturer of opium. Yes, opium, a drug now synonymous with destruction, then regulated only by paper laws that no one enforced. In the early 1900s, Vancouver was a global hub for the opium trade. Factories in the city processed the drug for export across the Pacific, to China, Southeast Asia, and beyond. Reifels Company held one of the federal licenses to produce it. The profits were staggering. While Chinese laborers were scapegoated and arrested under Canada's increasingly racist anti-drug laws, white businessmen like Reifel quietly made fortunes manufacturing the same product, legally. When the government eventually banned opium production in 1908, the Reifels simply shifted industries. They moved into brewing and distilling, later becoming key figures during the Prohibition era, operating what historians now describe as the most sophisticated smuggling network on the Pacific Coast. Ships left Vancouver loaded with liquor bound for California, protected by legal loopholes and friendly officials. By the 1930s, the Reifels were one of Western Canada's wealthiest families. And when the law finally caught up, they did what the Bronfmans did. They laundered their image through generosity. Museums, bird sanctuaries, and foundations sprang up bearing their name. The Reifel Migratory Bird Sanctuary near Vancouver stands as one of the most visited nature sites in Canada, a monument to conservation, built on profits from addiction and smuggling. Few Canadians walking those wetlands know the irony of its origins, that the land was once purchased with the proceeds of narcotics and illegal liquor. The Reifels, like the Bronfmans, mastered the Canadian art of redemption. Money cleansed by charity, crime buried under civic virtue. History remembers them not as traffickers or smugglers, but as benefactors. And that, perhaps, is the most Canadian crime of all. Not the breaking of law, but the rewriting of reputation. The McGills: education, slavery, and erasure. If the Bronfmans sold whiskey and the Reifels sold narcotics, the McGill family sold something even darker: human lives. James McGill is remembered as a pioneer, a merchant, and the founder of one of Canada's greatest universities. His bronze statue stands proudly on the Montreal campus, his name engraved in stone and scholarship. But the truth behind that legacy is rarely spoken aloud. James McGill was a slave owner. In the late 1700s, he owned at least 6 enslaved people, Indigenous and African, whom he bought, sold, and exploited on his Montreal estate. Among them was a woman named Sarah, and her 2 children, whose lives remain largely unrecorded beyond the bills of sale that listed them as property. Slavery in Canada did not look like the plantation fields of the American South. It was quieter, domestic, and often hidden behind polite society. But it existed, and men like McGill profited from it. The wealth he accumulated through trade, including the fur business, which itself relied on colonial exploitation, became the seed money that founded McGill University, a school built on the labor and suffering of those who had no voice in its creation. For over 2 centuries, this truth was buried under the marble floors of academia. McGill University celebrated its founder as a visionary without ever confronting the full weight of his actions. Only in recent years have students and historians begun to demand acknowledgement, not erasure, but honesty. In 2020, the university released a report confirming McGill's ownership of enslaved people and his participation in the slave economy. But no buildings were renamed, no statues were removed, because confronting the past risks unraveling the comfort of the present. The McGill legacy is perhaps the most haunting of all. It shows that Canada's respectability, its universities, its institutions, its clean image, was never separate from exploitation. It was built upon it. And just like the Bronfmans and Reifels, that legacy was washed in philanthropy. Scholarships, donations, and plaques celebrating generosity, all layered over a foundation of pain. The art of redemption. If these stories sound disconnected, whiskey, opium, slavery, they're not. They form a single pattern: the transformation of crime into culture, of vice into virtue. The Bronfmans funded museums, the Reifels built sanctuaries, the McGills founded universities, and in each case the result was the same: a public image so respectable it erased the source of their wealth. This is how power sustains itself in polite societies, not by denying its sins, but by outliving them, by turning ill-gotten gains into symbols of civilization. The irony runs deep. Canada, often seen as the world's moral neighbor, owes much of its elite wealth to the very vices it now condemns. The families that broke laws later helped right them. The tycoons who once trafficked liquor or drugs became national heroes and donors. When historians tried to trace these origins, they ran into a wall of silence. Sanitized archives, missing documents, and the quiet complicity of institutions that owed their existence to those fortunes. Universities bearing the names of slavers, museums funded by smugglers, bird sanctuaries built by brewers who once trafficked narcotics. It's not ancient history. It's modern Canada, a nation that built its identity on denial. The polite cover-up. The genius of Canadian corruption has always been subtlety. Unlike the United States, where robber barons flaunted their power, Canadian elites wrapped theirs in humility. They smiled for portraits, funded symphonies, and spoke of national progress. But their money told another story. When the Bronfmans faced criticism, they hired historians to write official biographies that portrayed them as visionary businessmen, not opportunists who thrived on America's prohibition misery. When the Reifels opium dealing surfaced, their descendants poured donations into environmental conservation, a noble cause that effectively rewrote their family name. And when McGill University faced scrutiny, it released a statement of reflection, but no apology. Each act of philanthropy became a shield, proof that redemption, in Canada, can be bought in endowments and naming rights. And so, the myth of the moral nation endured. Because when you fund a hospital, people forget how you earned the money. When your name is carved on a library, no one asks whose suffering paid for the bricks. This is not just about history. It's about memory. Who gets to define it, and who gets erased from it? The cost of forgetting. Walk through downtown Montreal, and you'll see the Bronfman building glowing under glass and steel. Drive through the wetlands near Vancouver, and you'll see the Reifels sanctuary teeming with birds. Step onto the campus of McGill University, and you'll see students crossing a lawn named after a man who owned other human beings. To the casual eye, it's progress. Monuments to philanthropy, education, and nature. But to those who know, it's something else. A quiet museum of moral amnesia. Because nations, like people, build myths to protect themselves. Canada's myth is politeness. The belief that corruption, exploitation, and greed are foreign problems. But every empire of wealth begins somewhere uncomfortable. The United States had its slave plantations. Britain had its colonies. And Canada had its polite profiteers. Men who made their fortunes from the addictions, labors, and bodies of others. The difference is, Canada learned to hide it better. The legacy of silence. When money becomes history, history becomes selective. Generations of students have studied business at the Bronfman School, biology at McGill, and ecology at Reifels Sanctuary without ever learning where those names came from. Because education, too, is part of the cover-up. Textbooks praise pioneers, not profiteers. Biographies celebrate philanthropy, not the exploitation that paid for it. And so the cycle continues. Wealth turned into virtue, virtue turned into myth, and myth turned into identity. It's not that Canadians are unwilling to face the truth. It's that the truth threatens the stories that make them feel righteous. Admitting that their elites got rich from what's now illegal means admitting that the country's moral foundation isn't as clean as it seems. But truth, like history, doesn't disappear when ignored. It waits. It seeps through archives, through rediscovered letters, through the work of journalists and historians who refuse to stay quiet. The price of respectability. Today, when we hear the names Bronfman, Reifel, and McGill, we think of charity, legacy, and prestige. We rarely think of whiskey smuggled across frozen rivers, or opium packed into crates bound for Asia, or enslaved families forced to serve a man whose name now crowns a university. That silence is not accidental. It's the result of generations of rewriting, reframing, and respectability. A system that teaches us to remember generosity, but forget guilt. Yet the truth still matters. Because understanding how these fortunes were made isn't about tearing down statues or erasing history. It's about seeing it clearly, the whole of it. Every civilization tells stories about its heroes, but the measure of a nation isn't how it celebrates its greatness. It's how it confronts its sins. Canada's forbidden fortunes remind us that morality and money have never shared the same path, and that behind every building named for generosity may stand a fortune built on exploitation. The names remain carved in stone, but the truth, once uncovered, cannot be buried again.